And quick note on this episode, which I am currently editing from the future, my microphone disconnected right before I started recording, so I apologize that my audio is a little more echoey than normal, but I hope you still enjoy the episode. So Alex, thank you for being here. Welcome again. It's been a really long time since we spoke. I wasn't quite sure, but it was last year.
I did. It was the end of last year, I think. So there's been quite a journey on all fronts since then.
Yes. So for listeners, if you don't remember that interview, Alex is the director. Remind me, are you still the director of the Council for Responsible Social Media at Issue One?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. And you're an incredible advocate for kids' online safety, also a legislative expert. So I am excited to speak with you today about some of the headlines surrounding a bill that will, I believe, get our kids some safety online. So today I'd love to focus on what is KOSA and what it is not. And I know you have young children. So why don't we just start though by sharing, what do you love most about KOSA that you feel will help you protect your children when they get online one day?
Well, it's great to be with you again, Nikki, and thanks for having me. We got to stop thinking about it in the frame of the internet and social media and start thinking about it from the frame of any product that is created, whether it's an automobile, a toy that your kid plays with. Mm-hmm. And you know, going into buying a lot of these things, that there is a certain level of safety by design that is required, or that company will be held responsible, and they know that they will be held responsible, that either people can sue them or that the government will come after them and shut their doors or fine them. And that just does not exist at all in this world. So what I love most about KOSA and the broader movement towards kids' online safety is the safety by design orientation, and specifically things like the duty of care. There is a duty of care for these companies to ensure that they're taking reasonable measures to make sure that our kids are not seeing the worst forms of content, are not being flooded with that for random searches or just because the algorithm has pushed them in that direction. That is definitely at the core of what I love about this. There's so much more I could say, but at the end of this, it comes back to basic design and understanding this is a product that is created by a company for profit. And this law would put us back in alignment with the idea of product liability standards.
Great. Okay. So can you explain more about the duty of care piece? If we think about right now, there could be a video on TikTok that explains how to, and this is literally one that I've seen before, take your own life without any pain in 5 steps. And a child views that video and carries out that action and passes away. Right now, as it is, TikTok will not have liability. So what will change around that specific scenario with KOSA?
So the big thing to understand here is that it's the way in which the content is received by the individual, right? And so the companies are required now under this law, they would be required to make sure that is not coming to audiences in mass. And it's not that like that content doesn't exist. It's not this bill does not in any way censor anything from coming out there. We have First Amendment. It's a very strong First Amendment in this country. So this is about ensuring that the algorithms, the design features are not pushing that, and that the companies are taking reasonable steps to ensure that they're not actually in front of children. So whether that happens to hit one child's inbox because they search for it is very different than if it's being pushed to a large number of people.
Okay. So if that family can show that this was served to this child in an algorithm and not searched for, then the company would be held liable for that.
They could be, yes. And there's ways in which the government can step in and really ensure that the companies are held accountable.
Okay. And so I know that one of the concerns is that the tech companies will then proactively just remove a lot of that content so that they are never held liable for it, therefore censoring people's speech. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it goes back to the core of product design. So this is not a censorship bill. I think we have to understand. Yeah. People have argued first on the left and then on the right about different ways in which this bill is not. This is not a bill in which people are going to be censored. This is not a way. It does not stop any individual from producing any piece of content. It does not in any way prohibit you, Nikki, from writing anything. The companies then are required to ensure that their terms of service are met. There's a very limited number of things here, right? So they're only required to prohibit the distribution of specific things that are the most harmful, self-harm information, eating disorders, illegal substances, etc. And so at the end of the day, this limited, think about it in any other context, in any other form, whether it's publishing, whether it's any other product, and you can understand that when there are things that are clearly going to be harmful, that stopping this from spreading at large is not in any way censorship.
Right. Okay. And so in this example, to dig further, like TikTok should be able to catch a pro-suicide post and remove it using AI technology or whatever they use to monitor their content. That shouldn't be there in the first place because it should have been caught, right?
Yeah, I think that based on the levels of sophistication of this technology, that is generally, yes, I would say that's generally correct, that they should be able to catch this stuff very quickly. But most importantly, it's the virality. Again, it's like a few people see something. It's not a problem. It's about the scale of it, right? And not to say if I have 2 young daughters, if they saw anything like this, it would be very problematic. But at the end of the day, if people see it, one article, one image, whatever, that's one thing. It's a whole other thing when that is being spread at speed, it's going viral. And that's the way that the algorithms are designed, the way the products are designed is for engagement. And so this stuff is what's catching people and engaging them. And therefore, it's spreading at a much more rapid pace.
And because the companies aren't required to remove that type of content, because there is no duty of care, they leave it up because it has a lot of engagement and brings them profits.
Yeah, correct. Okay. And there's so one great example I've understood about the difference between some, for example, the Instagram algorithm and Google's algorithm is Google's basically going to look for relevance and quality. And they're going to rate them very meticulously so that when you search something on Google, you're getting a high quality score. It's going to sort of boost this in a very specific way. Instagram basically says, is this against our terms of service or is it sufficiently good enough to not weed it out? And anything that falls into that category, that the category of it's fine, will go at, and they'll spread it as widely as possible because they are searching first and foremost for engagement.
Okay. And there are some groups that have been concerned about their content being censored and content that is important to supportive content that is important to certain groups, like the LGBTQ plus community. And I'll read a headline or two that is, one of the first things that pops up if you Google KOSA or Kids Online Safety Act. And so let me start with August 16th. So Colorado Politics Media shares this article with the title, quote, "Vague, overreaching youth internet safety bill endangers LGBTQ youth."
2 things. First, vague and overreaching. It's not vague at all. The language is very specific. It's been over years of negotiation, meticulously drafted so that it's the duty of care has only a few very specific categories. So nowhere in this bill at all can anything be resembling vague. Overreach, I would say at the end of the day, if you think taking minimal actions to ensure the health and safety of our children is overreach, then okay. But I in no way think this bill falls in that category. And then lastly, to address the LGBTQ plus point, you have to understand that at one point, earlier versions of this bill had a lot of LGBTQ plus opposition from the main organizations. The big groups were out there, but this is not the case for the current version of KOSA or KOSPA. In February of 2024, all the big groups like GLAAD, Human Rights Campaign, the Trevor Project, and many others came out and dropped their opposition. So there's a reason for that. And it's very important to understand this. I think we need to take one step back though for a second, Nikki, and say there's a huge campaign being undertaken by the tech companies.
Yeah.
Meta has 1 lobbyist for every 8 members of Congress. TikTok, ByteDance, has 1 lobbyist for every 11 members of Congress. We need to just think about this for a second. And they are using whatever argument they can on the left or the right. So on the left, it was the LGBTQ argument. It was how can we trigger folks on the left to say this bill is terrible, it's going to harm people. Let's focus on this. Yeah. And not to say there weren't some legitimate concerns at some point in the bill, but this is absolutely intentional by the platforms. And on the right, you come at it from censorship. Free speech is at the center for most people in this country, but particularly for the political right. And to then push on that and say this bill is going to censor everything, all of a sudden we're no longer going to have any ability to write anything on the platforms is just, it's absurd. And that is really where this comes from.
And we see this in the headlines. So August 20th, a Reason magazine says, censoring the internet won't protect kids.
Won't protect kids. I think very clearly we see so many ways in which this bill is going to make the internet safer for your and my children, for so many others. So I think there's just completely unreasonable. And again, I go back to the censorship argument. This is not a censorship bill. It specifically calls out in the language of the bills ways in which this is not in any way prohibiting people from searching for information or for any sort of individual content to be pulled down. It's about the algorithms. It's about the design of the products.
Okay. And there's just so many articles about the LGBTQ plus rhetoric one saying some fear KOSA will restrict access to affirming content. Another saying that KOSA hurts LGBTQ kids and allies. So we've touched on that. But one thing I noticed in the last couple of weeks too is some narrative trying to be pushed that KOSA is dead in the House and that it has been killed. So this one, House kills online child safety bill. This one, that the kids online safety bill that had broad Senate support hits roadblock in the House. And so can you speak to what that roadblock is? Is it dead in the House? What's happening there?
No, it's very much alive. And Speaker Johnson has made positive comments about KOSPA or KOSA and is working through its process in the House. The legislative journey that it's on, the next step is to get out of committee, and it was supposed to happen the week before the House went on recess. And I believe it will happen as soon as we're back. And I think that leadership will understand how important this is. There's always roadblocks in politics. There's always things that are challenges, and each House is very much independent and its own creature. And so the House will take it up in its own way. But I believe fundamentally that Speaker Johnson will recognize the importance of this bill. It's not politicized. This bill is not going to mean Donald Trump or Kamala Harris wins the election or loses the election. It is so bipartisan. 86% of Americans support this bill. And we have 91 senators voted in favor of it in the U.S. Senate. 91. You just don't see that on substantive legislation ever. So short answer is no. There are roadblocks, of course, but it is not in any way dead. Okay.
And so as I covered already in an episode about KOSA, so there are two versions currently of the bill. So there's one in the Senate that already passed through and joined together with COPPA 2.0. So now you may hear it referred to as KOSPA. And then there's the House version of KOSA. And then can you explain again, if KOSA passes the Energy and Commerce Committee and then passes on the House floor, and please correct me if I'm saying the wrong words, what happens then, since we have two different versions of the bill?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways that this could be cut up. So one is that the speaker could decide to take the Senate version and pass it by suspension. He could bypass his own committee, or just take that bill up if that's the bill he preferred. That is unlikely because the Republican caucus tends to prefer regular order, and they have their own version of the bill. It's not like there's this starting from scratch with no version of the bill. But basically, if it did come out of committee and then pass the version, presumably a different version, then there is something called a conference committee, where the two sides get together and literally negotiate out the differences, and then they have to repass it. They could also just stick one, like basically once one version is passed either chamber, the other party, Speaker Johnson or Senator Schumer, Leader Schumer, could stick their version in a must-pass piece of legislation that goes through. So things like the NDAA or something else. So there are ways in which that could happen. And if a version of it has passed the House and Senator Schumer originated KOSPA into must-pass bigger legislation, Johnson may therefore be less inclined to say, hey, I'm going to push back against that and just be fine with going with the Senate version, even if he preferred the House version. So short answer is there's a lot of ways this could happen, a lot of ways. And also don't forget, we could have a lame duck play that's different, but that is, I would say the most likely scenario is you end up having to negotiate at some stage between the two chambers.
Okay. And that could happen in September?
That could happen in September. I think it's more likely to happen later, but that could happen as early as September, yeah.
And how is the presidential election going to potentially affect this process?
So everyone says in presidential election years, that post-August recess, basically nothing happens, and that there's, I think, historic precedent that's generally true, but not always. And at the end of the day, this bill is so bipartisan, as we've discussed already. It is not going to make an impact on the election. And at this point, President Biden's not even running for election. So the person that would sign it is not even on the ballot. So therefore, I think that in many ways it will not impact it. In other ways, of course it will. The calendar, the timing, the minimal amount of floor time that is remaining in both chambers is significant and is an obstacle. But it also creates a pressure cooker that can help sometimes to force and galvanize action.
Okay. And Rand Paul has been probably most vocal, Senator Paul, against KOSA. Not sure if you got to catch all of his 35-something minute speech about why he doesn't like KOSA. That was quite entertaining. I think he said the words beer ad 40 times. What are his main gripes, or did we already cover it, you think, enough? But what are his main gripes? And are we hearing the same kind of rhetoric from the House side?
So at the end of the day, he is a pretty extreme libertarian who believes that any government intervention in this world is problematic. Okay. And I think it comes down to the censorship argument once again, which I think we've covered pretty extensively. Any intervention that says that companies operating in this way have to do certain things is a strike that he thinks is too far, and it thinks it will in some way harm the economy, our freedoms, our ability to speak. And I think it's very hyperbolic and overdrawn and not reflective of reality. And you have to pivot back to what is the reality in which we exist in, which is we have a mental health crisis for young people. We're all suffering. We see how these products are designed. This is an industry these are the richest companies in human history that has no regulation and no oversight, no body overseeing tech reform writ large. There are other agencies that do pieces of this, like the FTC, but there's no technology agency to oversee this sector. And they have this crazy protection called Section 230, the liability shield that inhibits anyone from suing the platforms. So basically, his arguments, I think, are just very, very overwrought and sort of blown in a way that is not in line with reality. And we are faced with real harms. And you've seen this in other sectors, whether it was the automobile industry, whether it was the era of labor rights back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you had real need for reform. And there's always going to be someone saying any reform is bad for my self-interest, mostly in the private sector, or someone philosophically who aligns with that. And that's where he is.
And what's the vibe in the House? I think, do we have 45-ish co-sponsors?
Yeah, that sounds right. I think I heard 44, but I think I also saw that we got some other ones coming on. So it could be, who knows where the exact, they're coming on fast. Let's just say that. So it's moving quickly. And you have to remember the House version was only introduced a few months ago, as where the Senate had been working on this for several years. And so it just, once people are getting a drift of what's in this bill, understanding that how important this is, they're coming on pretty fast. To answer your question on the vibe of the House, what I would say is that this is, at the end of the day, it comes down to leadership, what will be the difference maker to what happens with this bill. But I believe that there are some grumblings that we've heard similar to things we saw in the Senate at the nascent stages of the launch of KOSA. But at the end of the day, you have a lot more people understanding the parents' perspective, the young people's perspective, who have been the greatest advocates of this legislation. In understanding that, they get that this is necessary, and they see it in their own lives like you and I do, and understand that we must do something to fix this. And this is a great starting place. This will make a huge difference in how we interact with the world online.
And you said that it comes down to leadership. And so we need parents to reach out to their representatives in the House. And I did. And mine said, she doesn't she didn't say straight up, but I know she doesn't co-sponsor, but she said that it really comes down to leadership, bringing the bill to the floor for a vote. And at that time, she will consider my thoughts about KOSA. But from what I understand, it's important for there to be co-sponsors, for our representatives to co-sponsor, which increases the chance for it going for a vote. So am I right there? And do we need to continue to be reaching out to our representatives?
100%. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, because the calendar is short, it is more in leadership's hands than if this was in January of 2025 and we're working through a bill at the beginning of a legislative session. But you're absolutely correct. And for those listening, or parents listening to this, to feel empowered, to push your legislator, to push your member of Congress, to push, if your senator is one of the very few who haven't signed on, to push them as well. Critical. At the end of the day, if this number goes from 44 to 150 or 200 and change, the leadership will have to take it even more seriously. And that's what happened in the Senate. It just took a long time to get there. And of course, people are now back in their districts campaigning, et cetera. But there are staffers in DC who write memos to them every day and say, this bill is getting a lot of attention. This bill is really important. Yeah.
What is the most effective way for parents to contact their representative? Is it a phone call? Is it a message on their website? Obviously, going down to the office would be great, but no one has time for that.
Yeah, I think a phone call where you talk directly to the representative is great, or to the staff there is fantastic. Emails are good. At the end of the day, every member does this stuff differently, but having worked on Capitol Hill and knowing a lot of folks who have, they get reports every week that say, we've gotten this many calls about this, we've got this many emails. I would say phone calls and expressing your vociferous desire for this bill to pass will get through to the member themselves, and that will make a big difference.
Right. And your personal experiences, right? I know there's a lot of organizations putting out campaigns where there's a template and you kind of just send out a template. When I was lobbying recently, I asked one of the staffers, what do you do do you separate the ones you know are templates versus personalized contacts? And she said they go in a different pile, and they still consider them, but they're definitely in a different pile. So I think stressing the importance of writing that personalized message, even if it's just a couple sentences, seems
That's
important.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just noting who you are, you live in their district, and why it matters to you. And this can be one paragraph about pass this bill and something about yourself that makes it unique to you. Absolutely. And it makes a difference. It really does. Like, at the end of the day, these people you're their boss. You have to remember that. Their self-interest is directly aligned to you.
Right. Okay, so if I didn't say this already, go to house.gov, put in your zip code, find out who your representative is if you don't remember or you don't know. And Alix, thank you so much for this conversation, but tell me a little bit about what's going on at Issue 1. I know you guys are working to advocate for legislation that keeps people safe, kids safe. What do you guys have coming up, and where can listeners connect with you?
Yeah, you can go to our website, issue1.org, and you can see we're working on a whole bunch of stuff. We're Democracy Reform Org, and I run the program that does all the technology reform work. On the technology reform side, we're, besides kids' online safety, we're thinking very much about other things that will fundamentally reshape the way that we work on the internet, works for us and for our democracy. And so one of those is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and figuring out how to reform that, fundamentally update that piece of legislation from the 1990s that built the infrastructure for our internet that didn't exist in any way remotely similar to how it is today. So we're looking at finding ways to do that and update 230. We're looking at finding ways to make platforms more transparent and accountable. So right now it's a giant black box. They share what they want to share for the most part, and you only understand what's going on behind the curtain when you get a whistleblower coming out. And I understand you've interviewed some whistleblowers, and some great information will be coming out from those interviews. We're working on a whole lot of other stuff in terms of working on how to reduce virality, working on it. We also have a whole other program that's focused on election protection and the ways in which everything around that, from election workers and the harms to election workers to the information environment, and how the information environment is undermining our elections. A lot more. We're also working on national security and the ways in which our foreign adversaries are exploiting our internet environment to undermine American democracy and pull us apart. So yeah, there's a lot.
When you mentioned national security, are you guys involved in anything related to TikTok or the TikTok legislation?
So we did some advocacy around that, a little bit around the TikTok ban, and I would say that we as an organization are generally very supportive of banning TikTok because it has serious national security implications for it.
Right. Well, and now that they sued us and all this, we have more information coming out and being released, which is just reaffirming the national security risk that is TikTok. So
yes, very much so.
Okay. All right, Alix, thank you so much for this conversation. I realized as I was having this conversation that I need to have you on much more often to talk about some of these issues and break things down for parents. So I will be tapping you. I hope everyone goes to issue1.org to follow along with the work there. And I will keep everybody updated on what's happening with KOSA. Thank you, Alix.
Thanks, Nikki. Great to be with you.